Hello and welcome. In this video, we will be going over the instructions on how to build your Wheeled Champions Kit vehicle. Please note that this video will only cover the instructions on building the vehicle itself. In future videos, we will be going over instructions on how to calibrate your vehicle, create aiming mechanisms, make your practice and design logs, and go through a comprehensive check to ensure that your vehicle meets every and all competition requirements. Again, this video is just going to cover the instructions on how to build the vehicle itself. Alright, so after you open up your kit, you'll see 4 different bundles, one with your tubes and rods, one with your non-metal parts, one with the 3D printed parts, and one with your metal parts. What I want you to take note of is a USB drive in that metal parts bag. This USB drive is going to contain all the digital documents that are necessary for you to be ready for your competition, and has some other helpful information such as the practice and design log templates, a sample vehicle diagram, and the 3D models for the 3D printed parts. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to assemble the back axle. And to do so, what you're going to want to find is the back piece from your 3D printed parts bag. In addition, you're going to need the 300mm long carbon fiber round tube. You will also want to find the 250mm long square tube. You'll also need some of the number 4 bolts, 3 1/2 inch long, 3 3/4 inch long. You also need some hex nuts, and you'll need 4 ball bearings. And you also might want to find some of the heat shrink pieces and cut them into some decently sized pieces. So now what we're going to do is we're going to remove these support materials from the back pieces, and I pointed those out. They should be in each of the 4 ball bearing slots and then where the trigger should be. So what I'm doing is I'm taking some pliers and I'm gently twisting them out, and they should come out relatively easily. And if you find that there is a little bit of residue of that support material in those slots, what you can do is just take a little bit of sandpaper or an X-Acto knife and then remove those pieces like that. And if you do so, then you should be able to get these ball bearings and the carbon fiber round tubes and the bolts in their respective slots pretty easily. So now I removed all of the support materials. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go and insert 1 ball bearing in each of the 4 ball bearing slots in this back piece. So all you really need to do is just press it in with some pliers, but you can use super glue. It's not necessary, but you can. And if you plan on using super glue, what you want to do is just put a very small drop on the edge of the ball bearing. If you put too much super glue, it might seep into the ball bearing itself, and if it does, then your ball bearing is going to stiffen up and your axle will not rotate as smoothly as you would like it to. So if you're planning on using super glue to attach things, just make sure you're being very conservative with it. So again, I'm just holding that ball bearing right up against the ball bearing slot with 1 thumb, and then I'm just taking my pliers to the opposite end of the ball bearing that I'm not holding, and I'm just going to squish it down. And it should take a little bit of force to do so, but after you get that somewhat into the groove, it should be relatively easy from there. So after you press it in, you just want to make sure that the flange of the ball bearing is flush with the ball bearing slot. If it's not, then your ball bearing is going to be at an angle. It's not going to be perfectly parallel with the other ball bearings, and then your axle won't rotate as smoothly as you would like. So just make sure when you're pressing these ball bearings into their ball bearing slots that you're making sure that the ball bearing is completely flush with the ball bearing slot. So now what we're going to do is we're going to assemble the back pulley, and I want to note that this is not a mandatory portion of the video of the instructions, but it is something I found helpful especially for the oscillation brake, where you have to have your vehicle powered the entire run. So when you're making the backplate, what you're going to need are the two pulley pieces from the 3D parts bag, and again that 250mm long square tube. So now what you're going to do is put the two pulley pieces on one end, both of them on one end of the square tube, and they should align, the holes on those pulley pieces should align with the hole on the square tube. It doesn't matter which end of the square tube you use, they're both identical. But after you get those pulley pieces on one end of the square tube, you're just going to take one of those 3/4 inch long number 4 bolts, and then you're going to push that through the holes on the pulley pieces as well as the hole on the square tube. And after you do so, you might want to use a screwdriver, and again, when you do so, you want to take a number 4 hex nut and then secure that to the other end of the bolt. And you can tighten that with a screwdriver and holding that hex nut with some pliers. And if you do that correctly, then the two pulley pieces should be relatively secure. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take the two grooved ball bearings from the metal parts bag, and we're going to align each center of the grooved ball bearings with the two holes on the end of those pulley pieces. So I'm just aligning that with the hole, and then I'm pushing a 3/4 inch long number 4 bolt through the two pulley pieces as well as the center of that grooved ball bearing. And after you do so, you're going to want to put a number 4 hex nut on the end of the bolt, and you want to put not one but two. And the reason you're putting 2 hex nuts on the end of the bolt is so that you don't have to tighten that bolt onto the pulley piece, because if you end up tightening that bolt on the pulley piece, then it may be difficult for that grooved ball bearing to rotate. And the whole purpose of using the grooved ball bearing is so that it acts as like a rotatable pulley. So again, you want to put 2 hex nuts on each other, onto the 3/4 inch long bolt, and then you're going to tighten those 2 hex nuts against each other so that there is a gap between the 2 hex nuts and the pulley piece itself. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to attach this pulley to the back piece. So what you want to do is you want to align that hole on the pulley piece to the back rectangular slot on the back piece. So it should be the one that is just by itself. There should be 2 other rectangular slots, but this one should be in the opposite direction. So now you're just going to put a 1/2 inch long number 4 bolt through the back piece and the pulley itself, and then you're going to thread a number 4 hex nut onto that bolt, and then you could tighten that with a screwdriver and pliers to make sure that the pulley piece is secured to the back. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to attach the 300mm long carbon fiber round tube to the back axle. And to do so, the first thing you want to do is just place that over the 4 ball bearing slots in the position you want that axle to be later on. And then we're just going to generally mark where those ball bearings are relative to the axle. And the reason we're doing this is to identify where we are going to put the heat shrink pieces on and then eventually heat them up. Alright, so now what you're going to need are the heat shrink pieces. You have the 3 trigger parts, the gear and the trigger parts from the 3D printed parts bag, a heat source, meaning a lighter or heat gun. You also will need that small carbon fiber square tube from the non-metal parts bag. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the three of the four heat shrink pieces onto the carbon fiber round tube. And we're not doing 4 because we still have to put that trigger gear on. So here I put those three of the 4 heat shrink pieces onto the places I marked with a pencil, and now with the proper supervision and safety equipment, I'm going to take my lighter or heat gun and I'm just going to heat up these heat shrink pieces so that they are securely attached to this carbon fiber round tube. Again, if you are using a lighter or heat gun, you should be under the supervision of an adult or a guardian or supervisor, and make sure you are using the correct safety equipment. So now we just have to let this sit for a little bit, and now what we're going to do is we're going to slide this carbon fiber round tube through 3 of the ball bearings, and we're going to make sure we're doing this from the end that is furthest away from the trigger. And what we are pushing in is the end that does not have a heat shrink piece on. So again, what we're doing is we're pushing the carbon fiber round tube towards that trigger, and then once we get to the trigger section of the back piece, we're going to push in that gear piece from the 3D parts bag onto the carbon fiber round tube. It doesn't matter where it is, we can adjust the location of this gear later on, but what is important is that the gear is in the same section of the back piece that the trigger is eventually going to be on. So again, I'm pushing that on, and then once I have the location of once I have that gear on place, I'm pushing this carbon fiber round tube further than it should be, so then I can safely put that 4th heat shrink piece on. So again, I'm pushing that, and I'm going to make sure I have the correct location where I want that heat shrink piece to be. So again, I'm marking that with a pencil, just like that. And after I mark that with a pencil, I'm just going to expose the place I marked so I know where to put my heat shrink piece. And then I'm going to slide that heat shrink piece onto the location I just marked. And then again, with proper supervision, proper safety equipment, I'm going to take my lighter or heat gun and then lightly heat that area so that the heat shrink piece is securely attached to the threaded rod, to the round tube. And now I'm just going to take a little bead of super glue, and I'm going to put a very thin bead of super glue on each of the 4 heat shrink pieces. You don't want to put too much because then that super glue again might seep into the ball bearing. And after I put that super glue on there, I'm just going to slide make sure all 4 of the heat shrink pieces are on the ball bearing. And now I'm going to adjust the position of that trigger gear. I'm going to move it so that the trigger gear is aligned with that center of the V shape that is right behind the axle and right in front of where the trigger is going to be. And once I get the location that I want that trigger gear to be, then I'm just going to take some super glue and I'm going to apply that to where that trigger gear is, and take a little bit of accelerator if I need to, and make sure that the gear is secured to the back axle. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we are going to assemble that trigger. So again, I just used some accelerator to secure that back axle. So now I'm going to take that small carbon fiber square tube, and then I'm going to use some super glue and attach that head of the carbon fiber. Attach that head to the carbon fiber square tube. Doesn't matter which end you put it on, but you just want to make sure that it is securely attached to to one end of that carbon fiber square tube. So after you do so, what you're going to want to do is take that pivot piece from the 3D parts bag, and you're going to want to take that 1-inch long number 4 bolt. And what we're going to do is we're just going to slide that hole on the pivot piece through the 1-inch bolt, and we're going to slide the 1-inch bolt through those 2 vertical pieces that allow that trigger to pivot. So again, we just put that 1-inch bolt there, and we're going to secure that 1-inch bolt to the 2 upright pieces with a number 4 hex nut. So after we get that pivot piece attached, we're just going to slide that the carbon fiber square tube into that square groove of the trigger piece, and we're going to make sure that the little extension portion of the trigger head is facing towards the gear. And now we're going to orient that trigger piece so that that little extension from the trigger head is just below, just in front of where that axle is, and is directly in contact with one of the gear spokes. So after, and then you also want to check, you can hold that gear in place with your finger and try to rotate the axle. If the axle is able to rotate, you want to change the position of that trigger. So now that I have the position I want, I'm just going to mark that location of the pivot piece with a pencil, and now I'm going to take some super glue and put that super glue where that pivot piece would be based on the location I marked. And again, I'm just going to put that trigger piece back into the pivot piece, and I'm just going to let it sit there, maybe use some accelerator to speed up the drying process, but you just want to make sure that the trigger is securely attached to the pivot piece and that the head makes secure contact with that gear, with the gear spokes, and again that the axle isn't moving while that trigger head is in contact with the gear spokes. So again, you can also test to make sure that your trigger is working. If you place it in the gear and use a small amount of force, then that trigger should no longer be on the gear. You shouldn't have to hold that trigger in place after you have released it. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to assemble the chassis, and to do so what you're going to need are the 2 carbon fiber square tubes from your bundle, and you're going to need some of the 1/2-inch long number 4 bolts. You also will need that pivot piece from the 3D parts bag. So now what we're going to do is we're going to insert the carbon fiber square tubes into the rectangular slots into the back piece, and we're going to make sure that the holes on the carbon fiber square tube are oriented upwards. It doesn't matter which end of the square tube you put in, they're both pretty much identical, but you just want to make sure you're pushing the 1/2-inch long bolt upwards from the bottom. So you're pushing the bolt from the bottom towards the top through the back piece and then through the carbon fiber square tube, and then you're going to secure that bolt to the back piece with a number 4 hex nut. And you're going to repeat this process with the other carbon fiber square tube. And after we do so, we're going to repeat this exact same process with that front pivot piece. Alright, so again what we're going to do is we're going to insert the square tubes into those rectangular slots of the front pivot piece. And then we're going to take some of the 1/2-inch long bolts, push them from the bottom towards the top, and secure them with a number 4 hex nut. Alright, so now what we are going to assemble the back axle, and to do so you're going to need 2 more ball bearings, the threaded rod, the back piece, and the one of the carbon fiber round tubes. And just like with that back axle, we are just going to align that ball bearing with the ball bearing slot, and we're going to use some pliers to press it in. Again, if you're noticing that it's difficult to press that ball bearing into the ball bearing slot, then make sure you just sand that area a little bit to avoid cracking the area. Here I did not sand that area, so I accidentally ended up putting a crack into that piece. But if it does happen, it really isn't a big deal. You just have to take a little bit of super glue and glue that area where it did crack, and then use some accelerator if you have it, or let it dry for a little bit before you continue. So again, you just want to make sure you're being careful when you're pressing those ball bearings into the ball bearing slots, and you want to make sure you are sanding those areas if you're finding it difficult to press it in. Alright, so now we're just going to glue the 200mm long carbon fiber round tube into the little round tube slots that are just in front of the ball bearing slot. So again, just put a little bit of super glue onto the ends of the carbon fiber round tube, and then you can just slide that into the round tube slots that are just, again, in front of the ball bearing slots. And you can use accelerator if you want to speed up the drying process, but that is totally up to you. Alright, so in this portion of the video, we are going to go over how to make the wing nut braking mechanism. If you are intending to use the oscillation braking mechanism, then you can just skip this part of the video. But in case you are wondering what the difference is, so the wing nut braking mechanism is utilizing a spring. So essentially what your vehicle is going to do is it is going to go straight, and just as it approaches the target, it's going to slow down and stop. But with the oscillation braking mechanism, what it's going to do is it's going to travel past your point, and then it's going to reverse back and forth across that, or between that target point, until it eventually stops very easily right at the target point. Now, if you are a beginner, then I would recommend trying out and using the wing nut braking mechanism, because it's a lot more intuitive and probably simpler to understand and calibrate in comparison to the oscillation braking mechanism. But if you are more advanced and have a little bit more skill, then I would just go ahead and try using that oscillation braking mechanism. From my own experience, I've had more success with the oscillation braking mechanism, but again, this is totally up to you. There is no real difference in the speed of the vehicle in comparison between the wing nut and oscillation braking mechanism. The speed is more tied to the length of the latex tubing and rubber you're using rather than the braking mechanism, because essentially your vehicle time is only based on your vehicle traveling between 0.25 and 7.25 meters. After 7.25, your vehicle time isn't really counted. So again, there is not really a main difference between the speed of the two braking mechanisms. Alright, to assemble the wing nut braking mechanism, for the first thing you want to do is you want to slide that threaded rod through the two ball bearings. And what we're going to do is we are going to mark with a Sharpie or a marker or anything really. Just mark where you want the heat shrink pieces to be. So again, I just slid that threaded rod through the two ball bearings, and I put it at a location where I think I want that threaded rod to be. It doesn't have to be exact, doesn't have to be perfectly dead center, but again, I'm just putting that through where I want it to be, and then taking a Sharpie and marking where I eventually will be putting my heat shrink pieces on. So after I do that, I'm going to pull out my threaded rod, and I'm going to put that wing nut with the flat part going first, thread that wing nut onto this threaded rod, and I'm going to hold that wing nut with my fingers, and I'm going to rotate this axle clockwise. And if the head of this wing nut moves towards the center of the axle, then I have the correct orientation. But if the wing nut moves outwards, away from the center, the flat portion of the wing nut moves away from the center, then you should flip your axle and try again. And if the wing nut moves towards the center in that orientation, then that is the orientation of the threaded rod that you should be using. So now you should remove the wing nut from the threaded rod, and we are going to, in the orientation that you found is correct, you're going to take off that wing nut again. You're going to put 2 hex nuts followed by a washer, a spring, a washer, then the wing nut, and 2 more hex nuts in that specific order. So again, I'm going to put 2 hex nuts on the threaded rod first, like so. And after I put those 2 hex nuts on there and move it a little bit so I have a little bit more room to work with, I'm going to put on a washer, followed by the spring, followed by another washer, followed by the head of the wing nut. So the head of the wing nut should be closest to the spring. And then after I put all of that there, I'm going to follow it up with 2 more number 6 hex nuts. So again, here I am just moving those 2 hex nuts closer to the center so I have more room to work with. And after I do that, I'm just going to slide on another washer. Just slide on the first washer onto the threaded rod. So after the washer, the spring. After the spring, another washer. And then I'm going to put on my wing nut with the head side facing the flat head side facing the spring. I'm going to move that wing nut closer towards it so I have more room to work with. And then I'm going to put on 2 more of the number 6 hex nuts. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just hold everything with my hand and I'm going to rotate this axle clockwise so that everything is moved closer towards the center and we can slide this axle into the ball bearings. So again, I'm just grasping everything so I can, and then rotating the axle clockwise to move everything closer to the center. And then what we are going to do is we are going to slide this threaded rod onto the ball bearings, and then we're going to put our heat shrink. And just like with the back axle, when we put that heat shrink on, we're going to use a proper supervision, proper safety equipment, and a lighter or heat shrink, and we're going to heat up that heat shrink. So again, I'm just sliding that ball bearing, sliding the threaded rod into the ball bearing, and now I'm going to extend one side of the threaded rod. I'm moving this more towards the center so I have more room to work with. And again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide this threaded rod onto one side so I can clearly see where the location I marked, where I wanted my heat shrink pieces to be, are. So again, I'm taking my heat shrink pieces, cutting them into a piece small enough for me to work with, and then I'm going to slide this heat shrink piece onto those 2 locations I marked with the Sharpie. Alright, so after you get that heat shrink piece and you put it to where you want it to be, using the proper adult supervision and safety equipment is just like when we put that heat shrink on the back axle. In this portion, I'm not going to be demonstrating this just because I have to show a different portion for the oscillation braking mechanism. But after you get that heat shrink on there, you're just going to separate the 2 pairs of the number 6 hex nuts and then tighten those with some pliers. Alright, so if you're using the oscillation braking mechanism, then all you need is just the carbon fiber, the number 6 threaded rod, and then you just have to slide that through those 2 ball bearings that we insert into the front axle, and then we're going to mark where we approximately want that threaded rod to be with a Sharpie or a marker, or really anything that can help you identify where you want those heat shrink pieces to be. And after we mark that, what we're going to do is we are going to take the 2 heat shrink pieces that we marked and we're going to slide that over the 2 Sharpie marks that we made onto this threaded rod. And after I get it where I want, I'm going to use the proper safety equipment, supervision necessary, take my lighter or heat gun, and then I'm just going to heat up that heat shrink onto the threaded rod. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing with the other end of the number 6 threaded rod. I'm going to slide on my heat shrink, and after I slide on my heat shrink, then again with the proper safety equipment, supervision, and whatever other precautions you think are necessary, you're going to take your lighter or heat gun and you're going to heat up that heat shrink. And after that, what we're going to do is, just like with the back axle, we're going to slide this into the two ball bearings. And for the threaded rod, you probably don't need to use any super glue. It should be a very tight fit with the heat shrink and the threaded rod and the ball bearing. So here I needed to heat it up a little bit more to shrink it so it could fit through this ball bearing, and I'm just going to use a little bit of force and it should be pretty much stuck to that ball bearing. Again, if you find it difficult, then use a very thin bead of super glue and your threaded rod should be securely attached to that front axle. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we are going to attach this front axle to the front pivot piece on the chassis. So what we are going to need is we're going to need one of the 1/2 inch long number 4 bolts and a number 4 hex nut. And what we're going to do is we're going to push this number 4 bolt through the bottom of the pivot piece, and then we're going to push the center of the hole at the center of the front axle through, and then we're just going to secure it with a number 4 hex nut. Now your front axle should be able to swivel pretty easily, but we will make an adjustment arm to make sure that you can control that position the position of your front axle. Alright, so now what we are going to do is we are going to make that adjustment arm I just spoke of. So to do so, what you're going to need are 2 more 1/2 inch long number 4 bolts. You'll need the remaining pieces from your 3D parts bag, so that will be the stationary adjustment arm head, the adjustable adjustment arm head, and then the chassis arm for the adjustment arm. So what we're going to do is we're first going to put glue in those small circular holes at the end of the adjustment arm heads, and then we're going to glue them and lay it down on a flat surface so that the two pieces are parallel to each other. Alright, so now what we are going to do is we are going to put a 1/2 inch long bolt through the center of the adjustable head of the adjustment arm, and then we're going to attach that bolt and secure it to that small hole that is offset to the right of the center of the front axle. And we are going to make sure that this bolt again is pretty secure to the center of that adjustable head, and you might want to use a screwdriver to do so. And when you're tightening it, you also want to make sure that that your front axle is somewhat straight and toward the center of the chassis. If you don't do that, then you might not be able to achieve the optimal adjustment angle, and you might not be able to have a fully straight run. So again, you just want to put it there. It doesn't have to be perfectly center, but it should be just roughly center. You can always adjust it later. That's the whole reason of the adjustment arm. So again, what I'm doing is I'm making sure that this bolt is secured to the center of the slot in the adjustable head of the adjustment arm, and I'm also making sure that the front axle is roughly centered. Alright, so now what we are going to do is we are going to attach the chassis arm to the stationary head. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to put that 1/2 inch bolt through the hole that is not in that rectangular groove, and you're going to push it through the bottom of that chassis arm and then into the stationary head of the adjustment arm. And after you secure that with a number 6 bolt, you are going to want to glue that groove to the carbon fiber square tube. And when you're doing so, you're going to want to make sure you're gluing it in a location where that front axle is roughly center. Again, you can change that position later by loosening and tightening the bolt in the adjustable slot, but you want to make sure that while that bolt is in the center of the slot, that the axle is roughly center. Alright, so now what we are going to do is we are going to attach the wheels to the axles. And you're going to need the 4 treads and the 4 wheel frames. And you want to put these treads on the outer edge of the wheel frames. It's going to be relatively easy to put these treads onto the smaller wheels, which are 60 millimeters in diameter, but it is a little bit of a challenge to put these treads on the 70 millimeter diameter wheels. You may need to ask a parent or supervisor for help with this if you can't do it, but you just have to get it roughly on there, and then after you do that, you can adjust it like little by little to get that tread perfectly on the axle. So again, the bigger wheels is going to take a little bit of patience, a little bit of force to do, but it will be worth it at the end. Alright, so after you get those treads on the wheels, you want to take the 2 larger wheels, which again are the ones that are more difficult to put those treads on, and you want to make sure that those 2 bigger wheels are going on the back axle. So here I'm not putting glue on them just yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a tape measure or a ruler, and I'm going to put these wheels on there, and I'm going to take my tape measure and make sure that the location I'm planning on putting these wheels on is less than 30 centimeters. Again, this is a rule requirement, so you want to make sure that your vehicle, if the wheels are less than 30 centimeters apart, so that you meet this requirement of the rules. So after I know that the location of those wheels meets the requirements of the rules, I'm going to take some super glue and glue them down. You can use accelerator to speed up this process, but again, you just want to make sure that the wheels are less than 30 centimeters apart, so that they meet the rule requirements. Alright, so now what we are going to do is we are going to attach the 60 millimeter diameter wheels to the threaded rod axle. And to do so, what you're going to need are some of the number 6 hex nuts, and you're going to want to put 1 hex nut on the end of the threaded rod, and after you do that, you can slide on your wheel. And just like with the back axle, and once you put 2 wheels on there, before you tighten it up with the second hex nut, you want to make sure that these 2 wheels are less than 30 centimeters apart. Again, this is a requirement from the 2022 to 2023 rules. So I'm just sliding these 2 wheels on there. I put a hex nut first, then the wheel, and then I'm taking my measuring tape and I'm making sure that the wheels are less than 30 centimeters apart. And after I know that these wheels are less than 30 centimeters apart, I can take that second hex nut and put it on the other end of the threaded rod, so that essentially the wheels are sandwiched in between 2 threaded rods. Excuse me, the wheel is sandwiched in between 2 number 6 hex nuts. And then I'm taking 2 needle nose pliers, and I'm just going to tighten these 2 hex nuts onto the wheel so that this wheel is securely attached to the threaded rod. So at this point, you are able to attach that wooden dowel to the front axle piece, and all you really have to do is just slide that wooden dowel through the 1/4-inch circular hole in the front of that front axle piece. Alright, and now what we are going to do is we are going to insert the fishing line into the tip, one end of the latex tubing, and we're going to make a loop so we can attach to the front pivot piece. And to do so, what I'm doing is I'm taking something sharp. Here I'm using some wire cutters, you can use scissors or something similar, and I pushed that through one end of the latex tubing near the very tip of it. And now what I'm doing is I'm taking a flathead screwdriver and I'm pulling that fishing line taut onto that tip, the flat tip of the flathead screwdriver. And after I get that and hold the fishing line in place with my fingers, I'm just going to push that fishing line on and the flathead screwdriver both through those slits I made into the latex tubing, and then we're going to pull the fishing line through so that the fishing line is now inside the latex tubing. Alright, so now what you're going to do is you're going to pull both ends so you have an even amount of string and a decent amount of excess to work with on both ends of the latex tubing. And what you're first going to do is tie a couple of knots of the fishing line onto the latex tubing itself so that the fishing line doesn't come off or slide off that latex tubing. I recommend doing at least 2 to 3 knots on just the latex tubing before making your loop to ensure the greatest security. And to make the loop, what you're going to want to do is take both ends of the fishing line and wrap a loop around your finger and then push both ends of the fishing line through that little loop you made on your finger. And then just pull those ends straight through and you should have an adjustable loop. And to move the loop to either shrink or lengthen that loop, you just have to pull either ends of the fishing line. So either the ends that are free or the ones that are inside the loop. If you pull them, then you can either extend or shorten the loop itself. And once you get the desired size of loop you want, what you just want to do is just tie a couple knots with those ends of the fishing line. Probably 2 to 3 is good enough. But if you tie those couple ends, then that loop you made will not move later on. So after you get that loop onto your latex tubing, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take another 1/2 inch long number 4 bolt and a number 4 screw. And what you're going to do is you're going to push that 1/2 inch bolt through the bottom of the middle hole in the front pivot piece. And then we're just going to slide that loop that we put onto that latex tubing on top of that bolt and then secure that loop to the front pivot piece using a number 4 bolt. A number 4 hex nut. Alright, and now what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take some masking tape or some other kind of tape, and what we're going to do is we are going to put a couple small bands of tape under the latex tubing on the chassis. So again, you're just taking a small strip of masking tape here or any other tape, and then you're just going to wrap that tape onto the chassis just under that latex tubing. And what this is going to do is it's going to prevent your latex tubing from touching the ground accidentally during the run. And that of course, touching the ground, anything touching the ground except for the wheels, is considered a competition or construction violation in this year's rules. So again, you just want to make sure that you're putting this just under that latex tubing so it doesn't touch the ground. And after you do that, what we're going to do is, just like with the small loop we put onto the latex tubing, we're going to start putting a longer piece of fishing line through that other end of the latex tubing. And just like with the front of the latex tubing, we're going to take something sharp. Here I'm using wire cutters. You can use scissors or something similar, and I'm just poking a hole through that center of the latex tubing. And after I do that, I'm going to take maybe 2 meters to 3 meters length of fishing line, and I'm just going to, just like with the other end of the latex tubing, we are just going to punch that fishing line through the latex tubing using a flathead screwdriver or something similar. Alright, so now what we are going to do is we are either going to attach this fishing line and secure it to the back axle, or if you have the oscillation brake, or if you have the wing nut brake, you are just going to make a loop at the end of the fishing line. And the first thing you want to do in either case is you want to push that end of the fishing line attached to the back end of that latex tubing under the chassis and towards that pulley at the back of the vehicle. And then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take a zip tie from your non-metal parts bag, and what we're going to do is we are going to make a loose loop with the zip tie onto that back axle. So if you have the wing nut braking mechanism, then all you have to do is secure that zip tie all the way down and tighten it onto that back axle. You can use super glue to hold it in place, and then what you're going to do is you're going to make that fishing line that is on the pulley, you're going to tighten that, and then you're going to make a small loop on the end of the fishing line, just like what we did with the front of that latex tubing. And that's pretty much it. But if you have the oscillation brake, then what we're going to do is, instead of making a loop onto the end of the fishing line, what we're going to do is we're going to thread that fishing line through the zip tie loop on the back axle. And we're going to tighten that zip tie to secure that fishing line to the back axle so it doesn't come off at all. And after we secure it with the zip tie, we're just going to glue that in place. So here what I'm doing is I'm demonstrating how to make a loop at the end of your fishing line if you're using a wing nut braking mechanism. So it's pretty much the exact same process for what we did with that other end of the latex tubing. Alright, and that again is what you have to do if you're using a wing nut braking mechanism. But if you are going to use an oscillation braking mechanism, you have to make sure that that the latex fishing line is attached to the drive axle, because if it is not attached, then your vehicle will not oscillate back after crossing your target point. And that is the core principle of the oscillation brake. So again, what you want to do is you want to take your drive string and pull it tight onto that drive axle, and then you're going to take your zip tie and you're going to pull the zip tie tight so that it is holding that fishing line securely to the drive axle. And to make sure that the fishing line does not come off the drive axle during the run or at any other time, what you're going to do is you're going to tighten or secure the zip tie and the fishing line to the drive axle with some super glue, or if you want, you can use epoxy or really anything similar. So here I am just putting on a little bit of super glue that touches both the fishing line and the zip tie, and then I'm going to take some accelerator to speed up the drying process. And then after that, what we are going to do is you're just going to remove the excess of the zip tie and the excess of the drive string, and the vehicle should be just about done. So those were the instructions on how to make your wheeled champions kit. If you have any questions regarding the instructions or anything in general, please make sure to leave a comment down below and I'll get to it as soon as possible. With all of that said, thank you all for watching. If you have not already, consider subscribing. And with that said, I'll catch you guys next time. Stay unfazed.